The patrol car's lights flared to life in the fading evening, casting sharp red and blue flashes across the quiet Tulane road. The officer's hand gripped the steering wheel with a kind of practiced impatience as the old sedan ahead of him slowly rolled to the shoulder and came to a stop. He sighed, already annoyed, already certain he knew exactly what kind of stop this would be. As he stepped out his cruiser, boots crunching on gravel, his eyes narrowed at the sight of the driver. A black man, late 60s, short gray hair, shoulders slightly stooped by time. The man's hand stayed on the wheel, still and calm, as if he had done this more times than he cared to count. The officer walked up to the window with his shoulders squared, jaw set. No greeting. No kindness. "You know why I pulled you over?" he snapped. The old man looked up slowly, his eyes soft but steady. "No, sir, I don't." The officer smirked, a small, dismissive curve of his lip. "Of course you don't," he muttered. "Turn off the engine, and don't move your hands." The engine died. Silence pressing around them. What the officer didn't know was that the man he was talking down had once risked his life for a country that still struggled to see him.
Before we continue, if you're moved by stories where truth rises above prejudice, make sure you subscribe for more powerful Black justice narrations. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. Like, comment, and share this video so you never miss the next one. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Now back to the story.
The officer leaned closer to the open window, shining his flashlight straight into the old man's face. "License and registration," he ordered. "Yes, sir," the old man replied quietly. "My wallet is in my jacket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'll move slowly." The officer rolled his eyes. "Just get it. I don't have all night." The old man's movements were careful and deliberate. He took out his wallet, retrieved his license, then opened the glove compartment. The officer watched, hand resting near his holster, body tense as if expecting trouble from someone who could barely turn his neck without a slight wince. The man handed him the documents. "My name is Thomas Avery." The officer took them without looking at his face. "Any reason you're going 5 under the limit back there, Mr. Cena?" he asked, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "Trying to sightsee?" Thomas gave a faint, weary smile. "Just being careful, officer. My eyes aren't as fast as they used to be." "Yeah, well, some of us are trying to get home sometime before midnight," the officer muttered. "Sit tight." He turned back toward his cruiser. That's when he noticed it. Sitting neatly on the dashboard, halfway in shadow, was a small display case. Inside it, pinned carefully against dark velvet, was a medal, not a replica, not a trinket, a medal of honor. He stopped. His breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, the world narrowed to that one gleam of metal in the flashing light. He blinked, looked away, then looked back, as if he didn't quite trust his own eyes. It couldn't be real. Could it? He glanced over his shoulder at Thomas, who sat quietly with his hands on the wheel, eyes forward, not boasting, not explaining, not drawing attention to it all. The officer clenched his jaw and kept walking. He told himself it was probably a gift or something decorative. People like to pretend. People like to impress. In truth, the medal made him uncomfortable, because something about it didn't fit his story about who this man was supposed to be. Back in the cruiser, he rammed the license through the system, tapping his fingers impatiently on the keyboard. The radio crackled softly in the background. "Dispatch. This is Unit 12. Traffic stop on Maple and 14th, plate number." He rattled off the information. "Driver is a Thomas L. Cena. Running check now." Static, then a reply. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." As the wait stretched, the officer glanced through his windshield at the silhouette of the old sedan. He saw the faint outline of Thomas's head, still unmoving, framed by the slow pulse of the emergency lights. He remembered the medal again, the way it sat quietly, almost humbly, in the center of the dash. "Probably some knockoff," he muttered under his breath. People will do anything for attention, but his chest didn't fully believe his own words. A few seconds later, dispatch crackled back in his ear. "Unit 12, be advised," the voice said. Driver Thomas Leonard Sena comes back clean. No warrants, no priors. Military flag on file. Stand by for additional note. The officer frowned. Additional note? A pause. Then, confirming identity. Records indicate Thomas Leonard Sena, retired Army, Medal of Honor recipient. Repeat, Medal of Honor recipient. The officer's hand froze over the keyboard. The car felt smaller. The air felt heavier. He swallowed hard, staring at the screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. Medal of Honor recipient. He looked back out the windshield at the old sedan. The same old man. The same quiet posture. The same calm. He felt something twist in his chest. Confusion. Embarrassment. A flicker of shame he wasn't ready to acknowledge. Unit 12, copy. Dispatch asked. He cleared his throat. Yeah, copy. Use discretion. Dispatch added softly. And show some respect. 12. That man's a legend around here. The radio clicked off. The officer sat there a moment longer, fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Each word made the cruiser feel smaller. He thought about how he'd spoken, how he'd ordered, how he'd assumed. He took a breath, forced his face back into neutrality, and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched again beneath his boots. The lights still flashed, but the way he approached the sedan had changed. Just a little. Mr. Sena, he said, voice slightly softer now. Do you know why I pulled you over? Thomas turned his head, eyes calm, unafraid. I was driving slow, officer, he replied, so I assume it bothered you. It wasn't sarcasm. It was truth spoken plainly. The officer shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how loud his earlier tone must have sounded. You were going under the limit, he said, less confident now. I wanted to make sure you were okay, that you weren't impaired. Impaired, Thomas repeated quietly, as if tasting the word. No, sir, just old. And careful. The officer's gaze flicked again to the metal on the dash. Is that real? He asked. Thomas didn't follow his eyes. He didn't even glance at the metal. Yes, he said simply. The officer swallowed. That's quite an honor. It is, Thomas replied, but it didn't come free. The silence after that line was thick. The wind nudged leaves along the roadside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world kept moving, unaware of the history resting quietly in that sedan. The officer cleared his throat. What did you do? He asked, more curious now than suspicious. Thomas finally smiled, but it was a small, tired smile. I did what any man should do when others are in danger, he said. I stayed. He didn't give details. He didn't list battles or names. He didn't paint himself as a hero. He spoke like someone who had already buried more than enough. The officer shifted, suddenly feeling as if his own uniform was heavier than before. You didn't have to put that on your dash, he said, grasping for something to say. Most people would keep it in a safe. I don't put it there for people to see, Thomas replied softly. I put it there so I remember that how I live now should honor what it cost. The officer's mouth went dry. You know, Thomas added quietly, I've been pulled over before, not always with kindness. Sometimes a medal is the first thing an officer sees. Sometimes it's the last thing they ever notice. The officer felt the line land straight in his chest. He stared at the medal, then at the man, then at his own reflection faintly visible in the window. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the truth. Mr. Sena, he said, struggling for words. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did. Thomas tilted his head slightly. The way you spoke to me is the way you speak to others. I imagine. I'm not special. You are. The officer said too quickly, then realized a trap in his own sentence. Thomas looked at him steadily. And if I wasn't, would that make disrespect acceptable? The officer had no answer. Each word made the road feel smaller, the flashing lights more intrusive, his badge heavier on his chest. He took a slow breath. You're right, he said finally. I'm sorry. I approached you like a problem instead of a person. Thomas studied him for a long moment. You approached me like someone you did not expect to deserve patience, he said. You're not the first. You likely won't be the last. but you can choose whether you stay that way. The line cut, but it didn't wound. It taut. The officer glanced back at his cruiser, as if hoping it might offer him answers. It didn't. In my job, he said quietly, we're trained to control situations, to be firm, to not take chances. Control is not the same as respect, Thomas replied. You can be firm and still be kind. You can be cautious and still be fair. The officer looked down. Everything in him, in his training, his pride, his defensiveness, wanted to argue, to justify, to explain. But for once, he didn't. Instead, he listened. A soft hum of passing wind brushed against his ears, like the world was giving him a second to decide who he wanted to be. Mr. Cena, he said, I'm going to let you go with a warning. Thomas smiled faintly. A warning for driving too carefully? The officer chuckled once, but it wasn't mocking this time. It was a small, self-aware sound. A warning, he said, for making me think. Thomas nodded. Those are the best kind. The officer handed back his license and registration with both hands, almost like an offering. May I ask you a question? He said. Go ahead. Why didn't you say anything sooner? About who you are, about the medal. Thomas looked out at the road for a moment, as if measuring his answer. Because if respect only comes after people find out who I am, he said, then it isn't respect, it's performance. The officer felt the truth of that settle into his bones. He stood there for a moment, the night stretching quietly around them. Thank you, he said finally, for your service and for this conversation. Thomas gave him a nod that felt like a blessing and a challenge all at once. You're welcome, officer. I hope the next person you stop feels more like a human being than a suspect. The officer walked back to his cruiser slowly. The lights went off. The road dimmed again into ordinary dusk. As he sat in the driver's seat, he didn't pull away immediately. He watched the old sedan signal ease back onto the road and disappear into the distance. He thought about how close he had come to turning a routine stop into an unnecessary wound. He thought about all the times he had approached cars with that same hardened script in his head. He thought about a man who had once stayed in the face of danger, and now simply wanted to drive home in peace. That night, when his shift ended, he didn't brag about stopping a Medal of Honor recipient. He didn't tell anyone he met a legend. He told them, quietly, that he had been wrong. He signed up for a de-escalation course that had been sitting in his inbox for months. He requested additional training on bias and communication, not because anyone forced him, but because a man on the side of the road held up a mirror he could no longer ignore. And somewhere down that same road, in a modest home with family photos on the wall and a small display case on the shelf, Thomas sat in his favorite chair, hands folded over his knee, grateful for one simple thing. For once, he had been heard without having to prove his worth. He knew the world was far from perfect. He knew prejudice didn't disappear in one conversation. But he also knew that change didn't always arrive with fanfare and speeches. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet moment after an apology. Sometimes it arrived in the way a man chose to speak differently on his next stop. Sometimes it arrived when someone who had power realized that their first duty was not control. It was respect. He closed his eyes, hearing distant echoes of a battlefield long gone. Faces he would never forget, sacrifices woven into the metal of the medal on his dash. I did my part, he whispered. Now it's their turn.
If this story touched your heart or made you think about how we treat each other, take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling stories that challenge assumptions, honor quiet heroes, and remind the world that justice begins with how we see one another. Your support helps us share more Black justice stories that inspire change, spark awareness, and remind the world what dignity truly looks like. Share and leave a comment. Your voice helps bring these stories to life and keeps the message alive. Your voice matters here,